Good day, everybody. Welcome to this very special Zoom session. It is my absolute pleasure to um, contest or debate or introduce both and all some of the most fascinating, most pertinent, and increasingly compelling policy recommendations that Leon over the past, 40 years that I know have been campaigning and advocating. My name is Iraj Obedian. I'm an economist by training, have been in the field of public policy debate as an economist, focusing more really on the empirical, analytical, and data analysis, econometric side of some of the underpinning of the policies. I've also had the privilege of knowing Leon dating back to 1982, 81, 83, in that where I was a junior researcher and Leon already was a policy campaigner. And I was quite shocked by some of his solid, bold statements under apartheid. And he hasn't changed. That's the wonderful thing is his policies have remained relevant. He has remained consistent over the past 40 years. And I was reflecting in preparation for this session, how would I describe Leon's intellectual engagement with people's lives and why I have been attracted to him as a campaigner, irrespective of the content of his recommendations. And really one thing that I can summarize it is he's remained consistent, tireless, and over time, intellectually more compelling as those who oppose to some of his policies and they put their policies into practice, they failed. So the failure of the opposition became more of a empirical support for a number of Leon's policy recommendations. So I'm absolutely privileged to have this opportunity to coordinate this discussion. Of course, equally, I'm privileged to look at a book that is written beautifully by Tim. I've also had, over the past 20 years, I think, increasingly crossing paths with Tim, taking interest on his journalistic approach, increasingly to politics and the cross-section of politics and finance and economics. So welcome to this webinar. It's wonderful to have you all here, and it's a large number of us interested in this area, and it is really encouraging. Tim, I'm going to start with you as we discussion for where you come from, a little that I know about you, and from what you've written and debated. What got you going to write this beautiful book about one and only Leon Louw in the country?
Well, thanks, Iraj. Nice to be here, of course, and hi to everybody, and of course to Leon as well. I mean, you know, what first intrigued me about it, I guess, was curiosity. You know, I've known Leon for a long time, not very well, but you know, I've known about his ideas and things. And as you say, he's impressive in his forthrightness and his creativity and his warmth. You know, I was a little bit involved in reporting on the split in the Free Market Foundation and the creation of the Freedom Foundation, and you know, and it's sort of like just all of that intrigued me. But most of all, I was curious about ideas. I've always been interested in how ideas shape what we do. Leon's been for you know, decades a real proponent of interesting new ideas, and that's just irresistible for a writer. So, and then, you know, of course, there was the other thing, which was that Leon asked me, and I thought, and I as I've learned in you just don't say no to Leon. You can't say no. There's no in his in his vocabulary. As we were saying just before, Leon's position is, if you disagree with me, you're wrong.
All right. I need to watch Leon. First of all, it's really lovely to have you here, and wonderful for all your contributions. Let me, as an economist, as a fellow student of public policy, thank you for your leadership, for your thought leadership, and for your consistent and untiring leadership in this fairly contested and chaotic space. It's wonderful to have you here. Give us a 1 minute mouse to butterfly transformation of yourself from a young communist to a avid, rabid libertarian, a student of Hayek in economics and public policy. What happened?
Yes, well, it started off with me being in a right-wing Afrikaner community, Potchefstroom, where Verwoerd was a hero and worshipped, and I was taken as a little kid to his funeral. Then I went to Wits University, and there I encountered the anti-apartheid movement and some of the material about what was going wrong. And of course, the radical left ideas, Marxism, communism. More importantly, to be technical, and you would appreciate this perhaps, Trotskyism. I became more of a Trotskyite. And then as time went by, well, I'm going to tell very quickly my story. I saw a street trader being chased and brutalized by the police in Johannesburg. And as she was thrown in the back of the police van, she cracked her skull on the far end and actually died. Granny Moyo was her name. And I just thought this was atrocious. And I went to my communist friends, intellectuals, and said, is she a capitalist or is she a victim? What is this? Should she be free to trade, yes or no? And of course, they didn't have an answer. They just don't know. It's not the kind of question you're meant to ask. And then I asked, why are we against apartheid land law? Because it's exactly what we in communism want. All land belongs to the state and people are tenants on government land. So why aren't we saying that apartheid is correct in its land policy, at least for the majority, black people, and we need the same for white people? Of course, I couldn't get answers. And then as a result of seeing this lady, I thought she must be free to trade. Consumers must be free to buy tomatoes and oranges off the sidewalk in Bree Street, Johannesburg. And then I thought, well, does it stop at a certain size? And I said, no, everyone should be free, regardless of how big or small, to interact and trade with each other. And that's how I became a pro-market, pro-libertarian. I didn't see it, frankly, as economics. I saw it simply as consenting acts between, or capitalist acts between consenting adults. I just wanted people to be free to interact with each other as they wish, as a value, as a political system. Then where you come in, and I acknowledge immediately that I'm intimidated by one of the greatest economists in South Africa, one of the greatest financial editors with me here. But you would have been more interested in the econometrics and the macroeconomic ideas. They, of course, do interest me, but I have to say that my first motive is personal liberty, freedom. And the economics follows, and I'm very pleased to say that where there's more personal freedom, there's more prosperity. So they seem to coincide almost always, almost everywhere, for almost all people. There are, of course, exceptions which concern us and which I have tried in my life's work to address. The poor, the unemployed, the peasant, and elderly people, young people, mentally ill people, and so on. So these also concern me, and I would like to find a place for them in the economy and in the social system. I hope that sort of answers. It's probably not quite what you were looking for, Raj, but there we are.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. It's a great summary of the history of evolution of your intellectual and policy advocacy, and wonderful. If I may just start where you ended, is personal liberties and freedom that leads to wealth creation and all good things, job creation and so on, there's also a debate, as you well know, is where are the boundaries of personal and public? Where are the externalities? If individuals are free to do what they like and there are knock-on effects, if there are benefits that individuals or enterprises gain and bank, if you like, at the expense of causing negative externality to the society, be it rivers, be it the environment, be it the noise pollution, be it the neighborhood untidiness, where do we start and where do we end the management of these externalities in the pursuit of personal liberties?
Yes, I think this is one of the very tough questions and important questions, of course. And I would start by saying property rights. So you talk, for example, about polluting a river, polluting a mountainside, the beaches, whatever it might be. Well, who owns them? You know, who's a proprietor? If I throw my rubbish over the fence into your garden, you have a property rights issue with me, you know, and you simply get an interdict or report me to the police or whatever. Now, if I pollute into the river that you draw water from, the same principle should apply. If it belongs to government, which in reality, of course, it does, there's no reason why there shouldn't also be private rivers, but that's a different matter. If it belongs to the government, then the government is the proprietor, and you may not pollute the government's river. It's got the same rights over the river or the beach or the wilderness area as you have over your garden. And, you know, for example, I can't go into a post office and cause a nuisance or a mess or litter, just as I can't do in a private shopping center. The government is in the position in the post office or in a government building or in a park or in a wilderness area as a private owner is in a shopping center or a private home. So I just say that whoever the proprietor is has rights, and externalities are when the proprietor's rights, which in the cases people usually refer to are the government, are being violated, and they must just not be. And that's consistent with liberty and free market principles and property rights.
Well, in Transkei, back in 1980s and many areas today, in the old homeland, it was a common thing that the grazing was common area, and it was governed. There was no government, so to speak. It was traditional tribal governance framework, which was a kind of government, and it was a communal land. And one of the micro foundation of economic theory is about how do we manage this communal land. Now you're talking about the neighborhood, but the neighborhood can also be a piece of land that all the residents have entitlement to the grazing part. But there is a well-established, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, that those common grazing areas do not lead to best outcome if left unregulated. And therefore the role of regulation comes in, which is a best for the first impingement on personal liberties. I can go to modern day version of that in the middle of any metropole in any country around the globe. You will have the issue of common property management boundaries and the role of regulations that leads to a better outcome than if you leave it to just contested individual liberties. What would you say?
Yes, firstly, if I may pay tribute to you, very few people know about your very extensive research in the Transkei into the subsistence sector and what some people might call informal or traditional or whatever. And you went around romantically on horseback from village to village and conducted research. And as you know, and as you discovered there, that the chiefs do have rules that apply pro-rationally. They have, for example, grazing rights. You can't just graze in the commonage the way you used to be able to in Europe. The tragedy of the commons was there was no limit on the usage of the commons. In traditional African areas, at least in Southern African, most Southern African tribes, things vary a lot from group to group. There are grazing rights. In other words, you may have so many cattle, or so many sheep, or so many goats on a particular piece of commonage, and that is supposedly limiting the misuse or the abuse of the commonage. And if it's not properly done, and if the grazing rights are not properly allocated, or people exceed what they've been granted, then of course there's a violation, again, if I may say, of property rights. Who owns the commonage? And the owner of the commonage, as I say, should be in the same position as the owner of your neighbor's property. So I would always come back to that. You know, my children had a lovely saying when we were young about who decided what channel to watch on TV, or who decided who to sit where, or whatever. And we always said, well, whose is it? Whose is the chair? And the children came up with a lovely saying, who's the boss of it? You say. So who's the boss of it? And the boss of it gets to decide. And so it is with externalities. You know, and externalities are a fascinating problem for economists, because if, to use a sort of cliche, and I don't like the implicit sexism in this, but it sort of works, which if a beautiful woman walks down the road, for the wife, she might be a negative externality to see, and for the husband might be a positive. If you keep your garden well, that's a positive externality. You don't expect anyone who walks by and enjoys it to compensate you. If your garden is ugly and bad, then there are neighborhood rules and regulations as to how you must keep your property, where you may hang the washing, and what you may do. These used to be what are called restrictive covenants in many parts of the world, and in South Africa, conditions of title, and or neighborhood covenants. And that's so these things are provided for in law, and quite often economists who concern themselves about externalities are not appreciative of the degree to which thousands of years old law has already been dealing with this for a very long time and in a very satisfactory way. And you discovered that in the Transkei, and your work is certainly well worth for anyone to go and visit.
Leon, I just want to push on this thing, because it's one thing to assume that those who are in charge of these laws, the boss, so to speak, in using your children's analogy or advice, what happens if there is a mismatch in the growth path of individuals and the inability of institutions of governance to grow, to be vibrant, to be able to update and upgrade and modernize their thinking? So we end up in a situation that the community, the society, the economy wants to move in a particular way, but those who are so-called in charge, or they think they are in charge, or they represent the owner, because governments often, they see themselves as the representative of the owner, but they refuse to grow, they refuse to update their thinking, their legislation. And in constitutional democracies, the pace of legislative change, and I'll come back to your law paradigm, that it takes sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 years for legislation to change. In the meantime, enormous amount of damage is done to the economy. For example, look at our SOEs in South Africa. By the time the politicians who supposedly represent our nation, who is the owner of these, by the time they get their priorities sorted out and change their mindset and so on, an awful lot of damage is done. Look at the billions that was lost by SAA, by Transnet, by Eskom, and daily by all kinds of other agencies. It's because this governance institutions who can change the law, upgrade it, update it, technologically align it, they take their sweet time at the expense of the poor and the society. How do we deal with that?
Yes, this is exactly my work and your work you've done over the years, is you have to try and influence policy. You've got to get governments to firstly adopt good policies, and governments who are custodians of public property, they're in a custodial relationship with the property and the public. And like any custodian, they often don't do a good job, they do a bad job. And so what is to be done is you and I and Tim and everyone else has to lobby for, firstly, the adoption of good policies. You don't want a government implementing bad policies efficiently. So many policies are bad that the incompetence and inefficiency of government is actually a mercy. Thank goodness they're bad, because if they implemented some of their policies, it would be absolutely atrocious. I'll give you a very simple example. Right now, 80% or at least 50% of South Africans, mostly black people, live in what we call townships and semi-formal and informal settlements and traditional villages and so on. And basically everything they do there is technically unlawful. They don't pay tax, they don't have licenses, they don't have registered employees, and they don't comply with health laws and building codes and zoning laws and so on and so forth. So if you drive past Alex Township in Johannesburg on the east, everything that happens there is technically unlawful, and on the west in Sandton, everything is technically lawful. Now, thank goodness the law is not applied. If the law were actually enforced in black areas of South Africa, there would be literal starvation, and the prisons would not be able to cope. So sometimes the failure to implement the law is a blessing and a rescue and a virtue, and actually something to celebrate. Thank goodness they're bad at applying these stupid laws. But what you want to do, and what I work to do, is to get those laws properly adopted, properly changed, properly reformed, and then enforced. When you've got a good law, you want it enforced. Now, of course, as we know, governments around the world and custodians of municipalities and provinces and states can have bad policies, and they have bad consequences. You get a place like China, which is I'll be visiting again shortly, and played a small role in the creation of their special economic zones. A place like China, which was one of the poorest and most backward places on earth, suddenly, virtually overnight, becomes one of the most prosperous and advanced and progressing places on earth. How did it do that? Well, it created the freest economies on earth in these special economic zones, and something like about 2,000 free cities and open ports and EPZs and that sort of thing. So the same people with good laws and good government can flick almost overnight from destitution to prosperity. So what you want to do, what I have to do, is try and persuade the government of South Africa to adopt good policies and then implement them. And please do not implement bad policies. Continue to pretend they don't exist, which is what happens now in every low-income community. Thank goodness. Thank goodness the stupid zoning laws and licensing laws and tax laws and labor laws and so on, no attempt is made to implement them in most of South Africa.
Raj, can I make a contribution here?
Yeah.
Just sort of loosely on the same point. I mean, I you know, as a person who's sort of engaged in this process with Leon for quite a long time now, the writing the book was very illustrative to me about how reforms actually happen. What the genesis is of a reform process. And you know, as you say, they can be very frustrating, and they can be it can take a frustratingly long time. But the books, the subtitle of the book is called "The Legacy of Solutions," and that was, of course, a reference to the book that that Leon and Francis Kendall wrote way back in the 80s. And as a consequence of writing this book, I of course went back and read the solution. I had read it at the time, but readers, and it was just amazing how many of the ideas that were in the solution, you know, it sort of transpired into the real world. And this is how I now interpret reform happening. First of all, reformers say, look at especially free market transition. They look at it and they say, well, that's impossible. That can never happen. And then later down the line, they implement it. Yeah, you know, and that has been the pattern, not only in South Africa. You know, it's some things have not been implemented. But if you read what was originally proposed in the solution and what came out in the Constitution, you know, there's quite a lot there. There's quite a lot of overlap. There's some things that didn't translate through, but a lot did. And I don't know. For me, it was very educative. It was great fun.
Thanks, Tim, for that. I mean, if I just whilst you are here, push you on this about, and some of our audience also raised this point that elegant solution is one thing. Implementation of an elegant solution is something else. And it reminds me of Woody Allen, who once famously said, "Confidence is what I had before I knew the facts." The facts of the society is a complex story. Are we now overemphasize or oversimplifying? I mean, some of our participants, Frank Bald, even Pete, asking the same issues. And whilst you're thinking about it, Leon, I also would like to respond to our Ray and Louw, who says, if you were going to rewrite the solution today, where would you start? Tim, you start, and Leon can come back to that.
Ray, thanks for the question, because it falls neatly into an automatic response, which is, if you're looking for where you would start, I would start by reading, I should start by reading Leon Louw, Legacy of Solutions. I mean, seriously, one of the ideas was, in the process of putting this book together, was to re-ask the question about the solutions. And to go through, and we have gone through, I don't know, Leon, 20, 30 different individual topics, and just really just put Leon's ideas down, with a little bit of external sort of like debate kind of added in, but Leon, maybe you want to also come in on that and say which of the solutions in the legacy of solutions do you think are sort of notable, and which did the stupid writer leave out?
Well, just for what it's worth, Raj and the visitors and the viewers, we'd covered much more than actually made it into the book. It just would have been too big, too voluminous. So Tim had to make the tough decision of what to omit, and I had to suffer with the bruises of my brilliant ideas being kicked out by Tim. So yes, my take on this is, firstly, with policy, and this is how I work now and have always worked. I try to understand what the people behind what seemed to me to be a bad or counterproductive policy want. Why do they want that policy? Why do they want, for example, expropriation without compensation? Why do they want minimum wage laws, for instance, that victimize the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable and unemployed? Why do people want this? So I start by saying, is there a better way of achieving their objective? Let's assume their objective almost always is a virtuous one and an acceptable one. Well, what can we do? What policy can the government adopt that won't be counterproductive, that will promote the objective of, for example, more jobs or higher living standards or cleaner environment or whatever it might be, safer, less crime, all of that sort of thing. So that's really what we did, Tim, you and me. Well, you'd interrogated me and I had to come up with proposals, and they are in the book. And in the solution, we did that. Now, what you do is you put good ideas out, you put positive ideas out, you're sympathetic to the people who don't agree with those ideas, and you try to appeal to them, which is why I've always thought I want to appeal to people in the government, out of the government, the EFF. People might be amazed of the extent to which I work, for example, with people in the EFF or in Conta or DA or whatever, whatever it might be. I really want to find a way, and every person of goodwill needs to try to find a way of presuming benevolence, presuming legitimacy of objectives, and then saying, well, firstly, take, for example, inequality. Firstly, is it really as bad as they think? And in the case of inequality, it's nowhere near as bad as they think, fortunately. Things are a lot better than people realize, than the rhetoric has. And so, firstly, what are the facts? Secondly, how can what will bring about a better consequence? For example, people who want, like Donald Trump, tariff protection. Why do they want it? Why do they want their own people not to be able to access cheap products from other countries? Why do they want to penalize the poor by making inaccessible good stuff? And so the best thing then is to do is, well, let's find a way of achieving what they want, which is local industry and jobs and so on, local growth, as well as what's sensible. And not things like Donald Trump, which, his whatever virtue he might have, his view on trade is just completely, in my view, insane. But there we are.
Leon, I think the issue that Frank Barr is raising is, how do we start these elegant, practical solutions in a contested and racially, emphasis being on the racial inequality in South Africa? In other words, how do we navigate the complexity of adopting elegant, impactful solutions in a broken and contested social political environment? Because accepting any solutions requires some level of cohering around, yeah, that's the right thing to do. And the related issue is that if we don't, Helen asked, are we moving towards the tragedy of commons at the national level?
Yes. Firstly, I don't think things are nearly as bad in South Africa as the rhetoric on the left and the right suggests. I think there's the objective facts, and because of my concern about the statements, while the statement 80% of the land is owned by white people, that's a meaningless statement. It's not based on anything, and it's idiotic, because you don't know, what does it mean 80% by area, by value, by usage? What does it mean by numbers? If it's by numbers, then black people already own a lot more land than white people. If it's by value, then it's probably closer to about 50%, and so on and so forth. So we start by saying, what are actually the facts? And I've commissioned what I call the Wealth Project, which is to bring about research to come up with what are the objective numbers, what is actually the case in, for example, wealth income. So people can do research by looking. You can walk around any shopping center and you can see that the wealth distribution is not what some people claim and imagine. It's much closer to not equality by no means, not equality by race, and there isn't equality by gender, and there isn't equality by language. For example, my group, the Afrikaners, we're poorer on average than the Jews and the English and so on, and the Protestants are richer than the Catholics on average, and so on. So equality is, in any objective sense of the word, is never going to happen and shouldn't happen, and nobody should try to bring it about. What you should try to bring about is high living standards for all people. And you should be most concerned about the people at the bottom of the pile. They are the ones that need the priority. So how do you bring about improved living standards of people in, for example, informal settlements? Now, I do that by actually going there. I live there. I get mud on my boots, dust on my boots, and I'm involved with informal communities. You did so when you did your research. I do that as a daily part of my life. I would love to take people to some of these informal settlements. They will be amazed, white and black, will be amazed to find the dignity, the wisdom, the intelligence, the levels of information are much, much better than imagined. And I want to simply bring about economic freedom and liberation, starting with property rights. Give them all a freehold, freely tradable title deed over the land they now occupy, which might be a little tin shack, and it might be an RDP somewhere that is subject to another sort of truly idiotic law, is the preemptive clause on RDPs, that for 8 years people who get it may not trade it and have to personally live there. It is kind of so mad that it's hard to believe such a law could ever have come about. And you can't be polite about it. It's just is kind of insane. And so I would say remove all restrictions, allow, as Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, pointed out in Dead Capital, the dead capital is land that people may not trade, may not use for security and so on. So liberate all the capital, all the land, all the wealth, everything. And for example, the trade, the million or so spaza shops in South Africa, let people own them and remove those idiotic licensing laws and building codes and zoning laws and all of these things that render. Now, I just want to make this point. I did say that they don't apply these laws for the majority of South Africans, mostly black people. Well, they do in a way. The police use the law to go around and collect bribes and threaten people and get free drinks at Shabin's and free groceries from Spal. If you don't comply, if you don't look after me and give me a so on, then I'm going to shut you down and confiscate your goods. So the law is applied by means of corruption, which is even worse than if it just was ignored.
Leon, there's a question that Michelle asking us. It says South Africa is one of the largest communist parties, yet in rural areas, the land ownership is still based on feudal freedom system that the chiefs control or the traditional leaders control. How do we reconcile this? I want to add an incident and then you can comment on it. Back in 1996, when I was in the policymaking forum, one of the memos that we wrote as part of macroeconomic stabilization and redistribution was very simple. And we thought it was an elegant Louw type of paradigm. Said government must issue a title deed to all the residents in Soweto from Monday effective, and then put a task team to issue them and register them and so on. To me, that was such an obvious revolutionary redistribution, a black and white resolution of historic wealth and putting our black communities on a new path with the new dispensation. Of course, I use Soweto as an example. We could have gone to KwaMashu, we could have gone to everywhere else, Khayelitsha, etc., etc. But chiefs, traditional leaders, as well as the so-called, whether they were socialist, communist, or I would say illiterate policymakers in the cabinet, really opposed it up to today. That hasn't happened. That's shocking for me. And Michelle says, how do we recognize or how do we reconcile something which is very doable, and yet the cabinet is dominated by a number of communist ideology ministers, and they align themselves with traditional leaders. They really justify ancestry and all of that stuff. They bring imperialism and all of that stuff. This is completely irrelevant to the well-being of the nation in the day that we live. How do we navigate this situation?
Yes, thanks for that question, and it's absolutely vital. A number of things, and I haven't got enough time to delve into this, but there's a great misunderstanding about how the chiefs and the traditional leaders work, and an assumption that they are some kind of despot and dictator. And this is a legacy, strangely enough, of kind of radical left sociology academics, whites, Europeans who didn't really understand what was happening. There's a great deal of democracy. The chief in council, so-called, which is the chief with the headmen and headwomen of the villages, they meet, and I've attended many of these meetings. And when people say they won't agree to freehold title, my stock answer is, did you ask them? Now, I have asked them. I've been all around the country to many traditional leaders and asked them. The overwhelming majority are perfectly willing and free to have full freehold title in their areas. Sometimes they would like a condition of title that sale may only be to other members of that community without permission of the traditional authority. Very few chiefs are actually dictators. The vast majority work with democratic decisions made by the chiefs in council and often entire communities. I've addressed probably 50 tribal meetings or traditional meetings in South Africa on the question of land title. Overwhelmingly, it was agreed. And strangely enough, the first area to get full freehold title in South Africa was the former Ciskei homeland, where this is exactly what I did. And they introduced full freehold title. And today you can travel through that area and you can look around you and you can see the quality of housing and the number of trees, and that's in one village versus another, and you can see the ones with title versus the ones without. And so that's the traditional areas. Now, we talk about the Sowetos and Kwamashus and Khayelitsha's and the Longos of South Africa. Yes, in these areas, there should be full freehold title. They should all simply get a title deed. I've been instrumental to issuing about 100,000 title deeds, I'm proud to say, and that I think exceeds or is similar to what various councils are now doing, but they're doing it very slowly, and they basically don't know what they're doing, and they have lots of technical problems. I can't go into these, Iraj, but trust me, it's not so simple as the philosopher John Hospice said. There are technical problems, and they have to be overcome, and they do need lots of expertise of a conveyancing nature, and things like what to do about unpaid rates. Take, for example, the rent boycott of the 1970s. What has happened to councils is those unpaid rents and rates have stayed on the books, and they've had compound interest added. They reflected in the books as an asset. So the council supposedly owns this money, which it's never going to get. And when I said that they should write it off, they said the Treasury won't let them to because it will render all the local governments insolvent. So they have to pretend that they have an asset which they don't. And these are complex issues that have to be addressed. And I've done that where we've issued title deeds by getting contracts signed that the amount owed to the council stays the same regardless of getting title, but does not have to be paid in advance of getting title. In other words, you can get title without having to resolve. So in all of these things, that's my work. Find a solution. You know, it's one thing to find the problem. That's easy. But the question is, what's the solution? And that, I guess, is the subtitle of Tim's book, is solution, solution, solution. That's what I always say. By all means, tell me the problem, but then let me work out what the solution is.
Yeah, I think this question, before you come in, Jane is asking us, how does, and Leon alluded to it, but we need to unpack it a little bit more. And Jane is asking, how does the book, and this is addressed to you, Tim, how does the book illustrate how the reform actually happens? And the reform could be about title deeds and the complexities of conveyancing and balance sheet management, etc., or it could be the reform of the SOEs or any other of elegant solutions as you have outlined in the legacy of solutions. Tim.
Yeah, I think that this issue is absolutely a sort of perfect one in some senses, because I do think that what the process of going through each of these solutions meant to me was how much a jump in conception is part and parcel of the process of reaching a solution. And the people often talk about, journalists, we always say, is there enough political will? There's got to be more political will, and but it's not just the desire. Everybody has a desire that South Africans shouldn't be as poor as they are. That's not the problem. The problem is the conceptual step that has to take place. And actually, this is one of the things that we were talking about when we were talking about titling, the whole process of titling, and which I didn't know before we started talking about it in detail. And maybe, Leon, you can expand on this, but I know it's very complicated and everything. But I just love the idea of a deeming clause. What does a deeming clause mean? Just maybe explain that, because for me that was this was a great part of the process of reaching an outcome.
Yes, thanks, Tim. The problem is that you cannot, under existing law, which are old town planning laws and zoning laws and building codes and licensing laws and minimum standards laws and so on from the apartheid era. And to put it very simply, laws during apartheid were made for white leafy suburbs. In other words, it presupposed proper houses and gardens. And even in the new South Africa, they make, for example, a law that you may not smoke within 10 meters of an entrance. Well, have they ever been to a low-income area? There is nowhere that is 10 meters from an entrance. So these are elitist laws, elitist policies, which we've inherited from apartheid and still endure. So what I say, how do we solve this? We've got to amend all these laws. That's a long and complicated process of law reform on which we are working, on which I'm working, is to get these laws to coincide with reality, to reflect the real world, and to have some resonance with the real world. In the meantime, what you can do is you can have a deeming clause, which in law means you say, it sounds like it trivializes it, but you pretend that the person's the owner. You deem the owner of a shack, the owner of a settlement, the owner of a traditional house, of an RDP or whatever, to be a full freehold title owner. Freely can let, can trade, can subdivide, can develop, can whatever. So you deem ownership. And for example, you can deem also law reform. You can say until the law has actually been reformed, we will deem there to be no licensing law in low-income areas, let's call it historically black areas. And there was actually such a law during the twilight years of apartheid, which was called the Removal of Restrictions Act. And what happened is the Minister of Economic Affairs happened to have the same name as me, Minister Louw at the time, had the ability to declare areas to be exempt from basically any law. So you could just declare exemption. So he declared industrial laws and other laws not to apply to all sorts of areas. Strangely enough, the Removal of Restrictions Act is still on the books, still exists, and just has to be extended by administrative decree. And it can be then a deeming the absence of regulations and controls. Deeming the presence of title deeds is what the law can do and should do. And its deeming provisions are well known to jurists, to people involved with law.
Deeming is a good contrivance, some measure of transition, but it's got two problems. One is it's not bankable. And as you've quite correctly point out in your legacy of solutions, is that it's the leverageability of our assets, the unlocking of debt capital and leveraging it, which then allows you to get richer quicker, provided you make a sound decision that most people do. Now, if you deem and take it to a bank and say, I want a loan or a bond on it, register it, you can't. So I think that's the problem. The second problem is, and Michelle again points out in the question, she says, Mr. Louw, are you aware that in the Eastern Cape, many rural community members are expected to forego a percentage of their income to the traditional leaders? Because it's deemed the traditional leader still believes that he's got a right or she's got a right, who is not infrequently a political appointment on top of it. Now you've intermingled political appointee and then leadership, and that leadership then becomes a source of extracting revenue, wealth from the poor communities. This is a case in the Eastern Cape, but theoretically it's also true that whenever the title deed is not legally sound and enforceable, you will have this kind of extractive practices creeping in whilst you cannot bank your asset. How would we go about that?
Yes, firstly, a deeming law has to be an actual law, a real law. In other words, if it's deemed that you, for example, are entitled to run your spaza shop, or deemed that you're allowed to market. Give you a classic example. People in traditional areas who slaughter and market meat to the local butcher, the local canteen, whatever it might be, they're all breaking the law. They're not complying with the abattoir laws and the health and safety laws and so on. So what you can do at the moment, it's all technically illegal, and all they are subject to is bribes. And that situation in the East Cape, which Michelle mentions, I'm unfamiliar with it. But if that's happening, then the question is to what extent can that be enforced or ignored? And if people comply for cultural reasons, the way, for example, people might give some of the income to the church. It's not a requirement at all, but it's a very strong feeling of compulsion that people have. That we can do nothing about other than change values and culture, and I don't do that. I'm not involved. I'm not a sociologist or anthropologist. I'm a lawyer and an economist, and I want to get the economic policies right and the laws right. And then I want people to live by them, to understand them and live by them. And so that's really the work we have to do. So whatever goes on in the East Cape, by the way, that's where the first full freehold titles for black people were issued in South Africa, with a small exception called black spots, but we don't need to worry about them now, just for technical reasons, in case anyone needs to know that I know what I'm talking about. But yes, they were in the East Cape, in the former Transkei. Then there were some, the second place was in Bophuthatswana, strangely enough, under traditional leaders. And all the traditional leaders, for example, in the area between the Kruger Park and Swaziland, that big area there, they are all in favor of full freehold title. The question is how and when. And that's really what I grapple with and what we have to solve. Now, I do need to make this point. She mentions the East Cape. It's very important to understand there isn't one system, one black system, so-called. This is a very racist view. There are black communities, black values, black tribes, black traditions that vary enormously across the country, as European or white people know, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Muslim, whatever it might be. We need to understand diversity and generalizations about how tribal systems work. The minute you have one, you know it's wrong, because it isn't one system. No. So when somebody says 80% of the wealth is owned by, or in South Africa owned by white people or so on, the minute they say that, you know they're wrong, because they haven't defined what they mean. What do they mean by wealth?
Yeah.
You use an economist, an econometrician will know that it's a meaningless statement without lots and lots of qualification.
Yeah, we have 9 minutes left. The time has gone faster than I thought and I had hoped. I want to ask you if you bring the legacy of solutions and the mix of solutions, which I really enjoyed in part 4 of the book. That was my favorite part. Not that the rest weren't exciting, but I'm keen to know, what do we do today in South Africa 2026 with all the complexities that we have here and all the complexities that are compounding our complexities in the global context. If you were in charge of the country for 3 days, what would be your top 5 of the policies that you would attack, and why?
Well, it mentions there that the first thing I would do is abdicate. But anyway, that's not going to help. So if I have to be there, what will I do? I would say the first things I would do is to conduct a zero-based approach, zero-based budgeting or zero-based law approach on all laws. Every single law that's existing and every future law has to be subjected to a socio-economic impact assessment, which we have in South Africa. We have a good law, we have good criteria that should be applied, and it's unfortunately ignored. Every new policy, not just law, every policy has to have a socio-economic impact assessment, and the law is not observed and applied. And firstly, I would say do that. Every single existing and future law or policy must be subjected to one, compliant with the existing requirements in law. And then I would say, presume freedom. You see, that you want officials to go around and not just enforce a law because it's the law. You want them to enforce a law because it will produce some visible benefit. What you started off with, Iraj. So there's a negative externality, there's pollution somewhere. You want to go and deal with that, not because it's a law, but because there's pollution. That's the purpose of dealing with it. And so the same with crime. You want to minimize crime. How do you do that? So I would say start by having a system, an institution, as the Austrian or Hayekian school, Popperian school of economics would have proposed, a system, an institution whereby laws are properly evaluated and not presumed to be legitimate, especially since most of our laws to this very day are inherited from apartheid. All our town planning laws, all our zoning laws, all our rates and taxes laws, which have now been extended to farms, which is truly kind of crazy. And that's another thing I'm dealing with at the moment. Farmers pay for municipal parks, at the moment, under the extension of rates to farmers. So I would say you want to say we want the laws to be relevant, to be proven. There must be a default assumption that the law is not legitimate because it exists. It has to be proven from a zero-based process that this will produce benefits that exceed costs. Simple economics, Siraj, the stuff you know. I want a cost-benefit analysis on every policy and proposal, properly undertaken, properly quantified, and that's what I would require if I were forced to stay in government and not allowed to abdicate.
Thank you very much. Tim, may use any words of wisdom from you on that? Because as you write quite eloquently, we have a constitution that is not applied, on a number of occasions ignored. We have new legislation, whether it's NIH, whether it's affirmative action, or whether it's BE legislations. When something doesn't work, they pile it up with new legislation, assuming, as before, that it would deliver, compounding the adverse effects. How do we navigate that?
Well, thanks, Raj. Can I just, maybe there's a question from Pete from Verenigen, and maybe I can answer via his question too, which is that when you were writing this book, where did Leon's ideas convince you, and where did you differ? Well, can I just say about sort of generally speaking, is that I think the big difference between Leon and I is that apart from the intelligence gap, is that Leon is principled and I am flexible, and I'm very open to persuasion, too open, far too open. And that's so, but what the book has taught me, I think more than anything else, is to be very suspicious of people who pose as experts in morality. So I'm much more suspicious of people who claim high morality than I was before I started writing the book. And Leon's taught me to be a much more steadfast person, and to some extent, this is it's I can see that in my response to some of the legislation which is on the table at the moment, in Parliament, which is being discussed or just has been discussed. One of them is this about banning advertising for sports betting. So there's a lot of people who have jumped up on their high horse and have spoken about how evil it is to have sports betting. I don't think betting is a great thing, but before I would have been very sympathetic to that sort of to the notion, and I would have considered that banning advertising for sports betting would not be a terrible thing. Now, I think it's nuts, because it's not going to help. People don't suddenly, it's like, when people pick up a packet of cigarettes, they don't look at the sign that says that smoking is bad for your health and say, oh my God, I didn't know that. If only I'd known that before I, bought this packet of cigarettes. And the politicians are fantastically are vulnerable to this pressure that people bring on them to adopt the moral position, and they should, like me, think more about it in practical terms than in actually, by the end of the book, there was very little that we disagreed on, I can say, and mostly that was because, as I started off saying, when you agree with Leon, you're right, and when you don't, you're wrong, unfortunately. And that's just a law of nature. That's so. And I would like to challenge people to read the book, even if you are skeptical of free market solutions, especially if you are skeptical of free market solutions.
I would concur with you, Tim.
Cool.
I've from my own experience, and I want to use, and my apology for cutting you short.
No, sure.
We are in the last minute of this session. This is the bad news. The good news is that this is not the end. There are 3 more in-person review of the book, panel discussions, much more exciting than this. In Johannesburg 27th, in Cape Town 29th of January, and in Eastern Cape, Nelson Mandela on the 2nd of February. So information and registration and so on, all on the screen. Please do attend and please get involved. And again, I want to thank all of you, and especially thank Leon and Tim for a very exciting, educational, and lovely book. And let's carry on the legacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Raj. That was great.
Thank you,
Raj.
Thank you, Leon.
Much
Thank
the work the two of you have done.